Hi everybody, welcome back to another video of mine. This one I want to just give some insights on five things that really will make your taijutsu not work or why your technique is not working. Um, and so this is maybe a taijutsu tips kind of video. Maybe I'll start a series of these and just share some of the things um, from my own training because I know these are things that I have found for me that I've sought to improve in the quality of my technique, the quality of my taijutsu, and I also have seen it in others as well. And so there's nothing that's like new or mind-blowing about it, but I think it's important sometimes for us to take a step back and really kind of break things down into some common elements. And I don't care what martial art you're from. These are pretty common. I have friends in all kinds of martial arts. I love to train with different people from different arts and share ideas. And I do find there's some common ground that we all have. And it's fun and fascinating to really spend time with people in different arts, cross train in different things because it encourages you to look at what you're doing a little differently as well. So these are five things. This is whether or not this is particular to you and your training. I can't answer that, but I know for me, these are things that I find that stand out. So these are in no particular order. They're no particular importance. They're just I was sitting there and I thought about making another video and this just jumped out at me and I immediately came up with five. There are a lot more, but in my opinion, I think this is a good starting point for you to maybe look at what you're doing. Because here's the deal, and especially if you train in an art that's kata based or focusing on form, it's not competitive, it's not anything like that. Uh, that it's easy to fall into the trap that believing that your technique works because you have training partners who are cooperative and friendly and they do what they're supposed to do. They move the way they're supposed to move. You do what you think you're supposed to do, and you hit them or they fly across the room or you get them in a lock and you think, oh, this is great. And then the first time you meet resistance, suddenly things don't work. Or maybe you change partner, you're training with somebody new, and suddenly now that same thing doesn't work. And it's, well, why isn't this working? And this is kind of my little soapbox, but this is why it's dangerous to always train with the same people all the time because it becomes really easy for people to get into a pattern that when you train with this guy, you guys train together all the time. You instinctively know how his body responds to things. So when you grab the arm and you twist a certain way, his body's going to react a certain way, and it does it most of the time. It'll do it. But then the first time you change and you do it with somebody completely different, suddenly they don't respond the same, and it throws you off. So there's that as well. And then you also have the people that maybe want to resist a little bit. They flex up or whatever, and then now suddenly things don't work right. Those are eye-opening experiences. So these are five things that I think that we all can focus on. We all can take time to look at in our technique, even if it seems like it's working. Take a step back and look at it from the lens of each one of these five, and really kind of self-check. Is your technique really effective? Is it really working the way it's supposed to? So let's break these down. So the first one is timing. Timing of not only when to receive the attack, but timing also when to apply your technique. There's a timing to everything. Um, the person, I'm just going to use the technique, person throws a punch. There's a timing of when to move, obviously, to get out of the way, but there's also a timing of maybe when to block. Is it a shielding kind of block? So maybe you want it up there right away so that it takes the space of where that punch is coming through and puts something in there. Or maybe it's the kind of receiving where you've created distance and angling, and now you're going to bring this up because you're going to counterattack that attack with your block. Or maybe it's in the same timing of that where maybe it redirects that. So you want to match that timing as you're moving and kind of bring it up. So timing really matters on that because that's that's working energy with energy. So you're taking your energy and you're applying it to their energy, and the timing of that is what's going to create an effect that allows for the next. Um, there's a window that opens and closes. So let's say you receive that attack and you knock the arm out of the way. The arm goes out, and hopefully, if you do it correctly, that force transfers through to the rest of their body, and so their structure responds to that. But then they're going to adjust. They're going to adjust balance. They're going to adjust structure. So there's a window that opens and closes, and you have to understand when that timing is for you to do the next. And this is where the start-stop method of training starts to really have a negative effect, because in the beginning you need start stop so that you understand the parts, but the transition from step one to step two needs to then be a continuous flow so that you can capture that timing of that window. So when you move and you, whether it's maybe it's a nagashi type of thing or a sweeping kind of move or whatever that redirects or disperses that attack in a different direction and their balance is affected, if you don't take advantage of that in the moment that that's affected, then they're going to resettle and recapture their balance. And now you're going to do the next part of the technique, but they're going to be in a balanced, structured posture. And you might not be as successful in applying that next part, whether it's maybe it's an arm lock, twist, whatever, or even a strike. It doesn't have the same effect that it's supposed to, because you've missed the window of time from that. So timing really plays an important part, and it's in every part of it, even down to the micro movements of when do I turn my foot a certain way? When do I lower myself? When do I shift the shoulders? When do the shoulder blades come together? The micro movements also, there's a timing to those as well. So I encourage you to really kind of play with that, take a look at that. If you find your technique's not working right, consider the timing of when those parts come into play. And you might realize that there's a timing issue with something. It could be several things, it could be one thing, but it makes the big difference. Number two is the angling. We always hear about angling, right? Angling all the time. Angle, step off at an angle, 45-degree angle, blah, 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 blah. But angling itself is many, many different kinds of approaches. So you could have not just the angle of where you move, but it could also be the angle of how you receive, maybe the angle of how you strike, the angle of your hips and shoulders, the angle of the weapon, the angle of all of that matters. Even the angle of your feet and your knees. There's a vertical angle and there's a horizontal angle. So you got to look at things maybe a little bit more three-dimensionally on those angles. Um, but also, it's not just your angle, but look at their angle too. That, uh, and I'll take striking as an example. If you're going to do a couple or whatever type of strike where you're going to break something, right? The most the most optimum effect from a strike happens when it is perpendicular to the target. That's when you get the most penetrating force through that target. So guys that break boards and bricks and stuff, they want that perpendicular angle, right? But when you're talking about a human body that's in motion, being able to hit something at that perpendicular angle means that the angle of the strike has to be at the perpendicular angle to the target while that target is still in motion. And what propels your strike is the body. So the angle movement of the body has to also be in a line with the angle of the strike. And then the structure, the base support behind that movement also has to be at a precise angle to provide the maximum support for that strike. So those angles all come into play. And if any of those angles are off, then you lose the benefit of that. If your structure base angle is different than it should be, then you're going to lose that structure, that base that you need to have the power behind that strike. If your line of power generator or power delivery is off, then you're going to have energy going off at a different angle than where it needs to be going. And of course, if the attack, the relationship of the attack to the target is off, that's also going to decrease the amount of impact that it's going to have. So these are little things that all factor together in regards to angling. Then we also have um, the angle of yourself in relationship to your opponent. That if a person comes at you and they do this linear attack straight at you, if you shift off your angle, the targets then become exposed. So the way angling works is that you shift your own position, but also the opponent's position can be shifted as well. And I'll use the example of receiving that punch, that maybe you receive the punch in a way that knocks their balance off and they end up kind of shifting their body off like this, where now you can see you're more, the whole front of them is more exposed, and now you have more targets that are open just by the way you received the attack. So the angle itself comes into play, and even in the very, very beginning, in the very first move. So take a look at your angle. The next one, number 3, is your distance. Now, there's Japanese terms like MAAI and stuff that have to do with, I call it tactical distance. There's some other terms for it, but it's really the space between you and your opponent, but it goes even deeper than that. And that's another topic for another video. But really, it's if you want to just break it down on a very basic level, it has to do with effective distance. So in taijutsu and in most techniques, it's your distance is defensively, the distance is to make yourself safer, and that also at the same time your distance is allowing you to still be able to execute attacks. So effective distance is the ability to have offense and defense in one position, that your distance is creating space, creating safety for you, but at the same time it's allowing an opportunity or allowing you to still be able to attack. And as far as how far to move, there's these Japanese terms, storikami and stuff like that, like the distance of a sheet of paper, all this kind of far out kind of stuff. But really, honestly, it's at higher levels. There's a type of distance that allows you to be right at the edge of where you need to be. So they still feel like they can connect or that they're going to connect, but they don't. And in that moment, that's you're able to do something, but still stay safe. Um, in grappling and jujitsu and stuff, there's a distance of, we call it the teeter distance. It's it's the idea where you're taking them to a point where their balance is teetering. They haven't quite lost balance, but they don't quite have their balance. They're just kind of in that teeter spot. And that's a really important place to have your opponent, because they haven't it causes the brain to want to psychologically fix themselves instead of responding by rolling and things like that. There's a tendency to want to recapture balance instead. And so the awareness shifts from trying to kill you to trying to protect themselves. And that teeter moment is a very, very significant thing. So these are just some examples of how distance comes into play. There's also drawing. You use distance, they can draw the person off. And when they do that, then they overextend their balance point, or cause a break in their structure. And so that distance creates a weakness or creates an opportunity. And so a technique success oftentimes can depend on something like that. The way you receive or the way that you affect the opponent puts them in this position that the distance is such that they're at a disadvantage. Even close distance, moving in, taking space away. In Kotoru, we have Kurai Dori, which is the name for the different kamae, the different body postures. Kurai Dori sees the position. So that in itself gives you an idea, like you take the position. By taking that space, you control that real estate. You take the battlefield before the opponent, so you can get the high ground. It's that kind of use of distance that factors in here, that a technique can oftentimes succeed or fail just off that alone. Number 4, you're missing something. There's something in the technique that makes it work the way it does, and you're missing it. It could be a small little detail, very, very small detail. It could be a quarter-inch turn of something, or maybe the leverage point is just a little bit off. The angle of where you're affecting the body, again, back to angling, but that could be a detail. There's a detail somewhere. Maybe you weren't taught that technique correctly. Maybe you're missing some information. This is where it gets difficult when you're training with people who are um, they're interpreting something based on somebody else's interpretation, who's basing it on somebody else's interpretation, like a copy of a copy of a copy, that sometimes details can get missed along the way, and those details actually play a significant role in that. You know, it's like a golf shot. You know, you line up, you take your golf shot, but maybe your hand is off a little bit. Maybe you're missing a certain way to have the hips turn, and in that process, it creates just a micro difference in the angle of the shot. By the time it gets all the way out to the end of the fairway, it's completely off in the rough. But you don't realize it until it start to become obvious that, hey, this is going off on a different trajectory. That can happen here, that you learn a technique a certain way, and in the beginning you think it's great and it looks good and everything else, but then you experience that failure when you train with a little bit more intensity, or maybe the person resists a little bit, or it's a different partner that you're not used to, or something, some variable comes in, and then all of a sudden now you're like, I can't make this work. Or let's say you take a technique and you're learning something, let's say an outside wrist twist or wrist lock, and it works great every time you do that kata. But when you try to apply that part in something else, it's not working. There's an example. You might have something that's missing. Why does it work in this technique, not in this technique? There's something that could be missing. So this is why it's important to practice your kata deeply, to not just go through, like, kata are just speed bumps that you just, oh, let's just go through the motion and go through the motion and go through the motion. That's not how you're practicing these. It's like layers of an onion. You want to keep peeling and peeling and peeling and get more and more granular with how you're practicing these things, because the more granular you get, the more you start to discover the deeper elements that make it do what it does. And so, again, as I've said before in countless videos, this is why it's important that you train with the right people. You take the time and be patient to really dig deep, and never assume that you know something completely. I guarantee you do not know it completely. I don't care who you are, how long you've been training, who you train with, you will never learn everything completely. So spend the time to do that. The more you do that, the more you're going to find and discover things that maybe you didn't know before, and that now you start to see them in other techniques. That's how these other techniques suddenly become enhanced and better. So, so that's a very important one that I think all of us could probably focus a little more on, is to really dig into the what is missing here, what is missing. And lastly, number five, and I see this, I'm guilty of this myself. You're trying too hard. You're trying too hard. If you are training in a technique that involves a guy grabbing you and punching you, you place your hand on his arm, you block the punch, and now you're supposed to take this guy up, get the arm off, and throw him across the room, right? And you know that's what it's supposed to do. And so you get this, and you're because all you're thinking about is, I have to throw this guy across the room. And so you're trying to throw this guy across the room. That's when techniques fail, because you're attaching yourself to an outcome. And this is something that it goes much deeper, but I'm just going to keep it at the base level here for this video. But when you're trying too hard on anything, that means your expectation is set too high, that you're expecting something to work a certain way, instead of focusing on the present exact moment of what it is you're actually doing. Because if you focus on the present moment, the instant moment that keeps happening, those instances, when you're in that present moment, then you're focusing on doing what is supposed to happen for you to make it work instead of focusing on just trying to make it work. So, and I and I hope I explained this right in a way, but I think you understand the analogy of like the wrist twist, that how you'll see people just crank on somebody's arm, they crank on somebody's wrist because their mind is already focused on this is what's supposed to happen, and I'm going to make this happen instead of I need to make sure that the bone of my hand is placed precisely on this particular bone of their hand, that my finger is going to be on a particular spot, that I'm going to move a particular way in this specific moment right here is what I'm supposed to do. Because if you focus on that, the outcome is going to happen by itself. That's the lesson. If you are focusing on doing correctly in each particular moment, you don't attach to the outcome because the outcome is going to happen anyway, right? A plus B will equal C. You don't focus on C, you focus on A and B and let C happen. Now, the other factor you have to consider is that different training partners are going to respond to techniques differently. And this is also something that can mess you up if you're attached to the outcome. If you're trying too hard, you're going to train with somebody that maybe is not as reactive to something, or maybe they're stiff or whatever, and you don't want to really hurt them, but you're trying to create this outcome. That sometimes the outcomes aren't going to happen the way you want, because of all these other factors that really may not have anything to do with you. Maybe you're doing the technique right, but you're trying to train safely. And maybe your partner is new, or maybe they have injuries, or maybe they're just not that not the kind of partner that that you would need in order to make the technique work correctly. And I'm going to use an example of somebody that used to be in my class a long, long time ago. This gentleman was big. He was a big guy. He looked like a linebacker. I mean, just this huge guy, just big neck, big guy, right? And watching people try to do gyakuwaza on him, this mushidori, the elbow thing. You couldn't, his arm would not move. You couldn't do that. And it used to frustrate students because they would be trying to execute this technique, but you just couldn't do it on this guy because he's so big, his own just body structure will not allow for it. And when I would demonstrate the technique on him, I already knew I couldn't do that. But if I did the technique where it affected his balance and his structure, it created opportunity for something else. And that was the whole point, is that the technique itself allowed an opportunity to open that didn't exist with a smaller person that I had in my class who had incredible flexibility. And you would apply that very same technique and he could just, he would just go with it and you couldn't control him. You had to really cut off his ability to escape. You had to really do the technique correctly, or he could handle it. His flexibility, range of motion was incredible. Whereas the large gentleman, you had to do things to really create that opportunity that when you applied that technique, it took his structure, because it was the limit of his mobility was already reached early on. The rest of his structure was affected, and in that moment, you can then do the next part. So those are just two extreme examples of being unattached to the outcome. It's okay if it doesn't look like the kata that you see or how it's described in the book, if the circumstances are not going to be the right kind of circumstances for that. So that's again where you have to let go of that attachment. Stop trying so hard. So if your technique isn't working, you have to ask yourself, is it meant to work in this situation? Is it meant to work for this situation? And stop trying to force it to work. There's why we have become obsessed with the finish of something, that we have to finish a technique instead of allowing the naturalness of things to develop on their own. So the reason your taijutsu may not be working, because you want it to work too hard. You want it to work. You're so focused on trying to make it work that you're missing that microsecond moment. You're not focusing on the present exact moment, because if you were, you would adapt to that present moment. Whatever that moment is, you would be able to stay in tune with that and to move in harmony with that precise moment. Whatever it is. Even if it means you can't, you start it and then and that's it, because that's all I can do. But you're connected to the present moment instead of focused on the outcome. And that's the danger with kata training that you need to be careful about. That when we practice A, B, and C, we expect A, B, and C. And that's not always going to be the case with different people or different situations and circumstances. But through kata training, A, B, and C hold very, very important lessons. Very, very important lessons. It's not about completing the technique. It's about learning as much as you can through each part of the technique. Each part of the technique is its own school, is its own knowledge. And you have to tap into that. And if you're connected to trying to make something work, you're not tapping into the knowledge in that moment. You're not tapping into the knowledge of those parts. So that's the part that's really key on all of that. That I think a lot of people don't understand, because we live in this modern society where we're used to everything in nice, neat packages. And so we expect when we click this button, this result is going to happen. We know that. And we know that if we order something on Amazon, it's going to get here in a day or two. We know that. But when it comes to martial arts, there's a certainty, uncertainty, and this gets into psychology and human behavior and relationships and stuff. But so I don't want to go too far in it. But there is a balance between certainty and uncertainty, that you don't want too much of one or the other. There has to be this balance. So in martial arts training, you have the certainty of your training, the fact that you know how to move, you know how to block, you know how to punch, you know these things. You practice this, you practice the technique exactly the way it was written, exactly the way it's taught. You copy your teacher, and you know that if you're doing this the way you were taught, that's you're doing it correctly. That's the certainty. The uncertainty comes in when you either have a change in how you're doing it, some variable changes, or the response to that, the outcome from that doesn't match what your expected outcome is. And this is where things like randori become really important. Even kumite, sparring, or randori freeform kind of exchange. Because that brings in the uncertainty. Then it's like, oh, it didn't work the way it was supposed to. But also little things like training with somebody you've never trained with before. That brings uncertainty. And that uncertainty is so important, because that uncertainty challenges your certainty. That uncertainty adds life, juice to what it is you're doing. That adds that fire, that energy to what you're doing. Too much certainty stagnates. Too much uncertainty creates chaos. So having that balance between the certainty in your training, but also the uncertainty, and unattaching yourself to an outcome, allowing that uncertainty to be there, I think is a very, very important element. And when we try too hard, it's because we're not allowing the uncertainty to naturally happen. So those are my 5 things that I think maybe we can all focus on. And I hope you learned something from that. And just to review those 5 things: timing, angling, distancing. That probably sounds familiar to a lot of you. Uh, you're missing something in your training. You're missing something in the technique. There's a particular piece that's not there. And then lastly, trying too hard. So explore each of those. I really hope that you find something valuable in this that you can apply to your training. Maybe you're stuck in that rut yourself. I've been training this art well over 30 plus gosh, maybe even almost 40 years. I don't know, I lost track now how many years, but um, always running into these issues all the time. It never ends. You're always like, this doesn't work now, and then you got to go back. And to me, a path of martial arts is always about taking, two steps forward, one step back, but you're always still taking a step forward. If you can at least have that in your training, that's to me, that's a life of training that's got gusto to it. It's valuable, it's enriching. But you got to allow for that one step back. You can't let your ego take over and think that you're always going to be taking two steps forward each time. You welcome that one step back because it's in the one step back that you realize what you need to learn. You realize that you're not perfect. Your training is not perfect. There's always opportunity for growth and improvement. If you never are willing to accept that failure or to accept that backslide in something, then you are fake. You're setting yourself up for a huge downfall. And in the case of Budo or martial arts, it could be life and death. Um, in sports, okay, you get cocky, you get out there and you get your butt handed to you in a tournament. Great. You go back to the gym, you practice, you get to come back and you recompete. In real life, you may not always have that chance. That could be it. Your clock is punched out. You're done. You don't get that chance. Or maybe you're permanently crippled or some other horrific thing that life can be very unforgiving when it comes to mistakes like that. So better to make those mistakes in your training so you don't make them in real life. That's why you want to really welcome opportunities when failure happens, when things don't work the way you want them to work, when that uncertainty suddenly slaps you in the face. That is beautiful. That's where the best lessons come from. So I hope you enjoyed this. I hope you found it useful in some way. Please like and subscribe to my channel and like the videos. Feel free to check out all the other videos. Drop me a comment. Let me know what you think. How is this affecting you? How's your training? Do you have any questions about anything? And if you want me to make a video on something in the future, please let me know. I'm always open. I I want to kind of stay away from video teaching as far as technical teaching because I just I'm not a home study teacher, and I would just rather encourage you to find a legit licensed teacher, qualified teacher to get the hands-on training that you need. Um, but I like sharing my insights with you, and hopefully it inspires you and gives you a new way to maybe look at something or, you know, anything like that you could find valuable in your training. Uh, but yeah, so drop me a comment. Let me know what you think. And I appreciate all the support that I've gotten so far. This has been great. Lots of private messages, which is really cool. I'm cool with that too. But it would be nice if maybe you could be brave and drop a comment on there and ask about something or share an insight that you have so that other people can see it too. Because, we're all trying to learn this thing so we can all learn from each other. So thanks again, and keep training, stay healthy, and make every second count.